Good evening. Hope you're all doing well tonight. Welcome to your YouTube channel. Hope all is doing well. And this gives us a little bit of time to just spend some time talking. Communication is what lubricates relationships. So if you've tuned in, welcome. And once again, this is your YouTube channel. Let me make two disclaimers before we start. Number one, I'm only providing psychological information. And number two, I'm here to discuss psychological information as it applies to your life. Tonight, I want us to discuss a subject. I want to talk about why members of the African American community are reluctant to engage in therapy, psychological services, counseling, and so forth when it comes to the medical community. When you think about it, the job of a psychologist is to help people who are struggling in many different ways. They could be struggling with anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, relationship difficulties, parenting challenges. African Americans have difficulty embracing psychological services. Now, we're all in this CV-19 dilemma together. CV-19 has caused unprecedented struggles for everyone. People are having problems with anxiety, depression, suicide, domestic violence, marital issues, trauma, whether it's direct or indirect. So many issues are coming out of this pandemic. We know that medication for anxiety is skyrocketing. Medication for depression is up 35 to 40%. And here's an interesting one. People are struggling with insomnia. Can't sleep. The uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen, when this situation will be behind us. Prescription medication for insomnia is through the roof. There are people who are also having hypersomnia. All of this is the effects of this pandemic, that we're all in it together. As a clinical and counseling psychologist, therapy, counseling, provides a safe space for honest, open, and confidential sharing about your personal situation and the realities of life that people are dealing with right now. It is important to state that the number of African Americans who are now embracing therapy continues to increase and rise. But there are significant barriers that cause African Americans to avoid therapy for problem solving, dealing with mental health issues, improving their relationships, and for their own self-improvement. So let's look at the barriers. Let's look at the struggles. in terms of how comes it's so difficult for African Americans to embrace therapy, psychological services, mental health services. Number one, there is a considerable stigma attached to seeking professional help from a psychologist or therapist. The stigma attached to seeing a psychologist is unbelievable within the African American community, and it keeps many people from seeking the care that they need to recover and to heal. Now, here's something important to take note of. In the African American community, to be called crazy is the worst thing. Call me anything, but don't call me crazy. As African Americans, that's like a personal affront. Call me late for dinner, whatever, but don't call me crazy. To be called crazy in the African American community is like a death blow. It's the worst thing that can be said to someone. So that's a major barrier. The assumption is made that if you're seeing a psychologist, if you're receiving mental health services, you're crazy. There's something really, really wrong with you. And as a result, we got to distance ourselves from you. So once again, the stigma attached to receiving mental health services, seeing a psychologist, is just unbelievable. The assumption is made that if you're seeing a provider, you're a sick person. And I have to be careful if I'm seen with you, because others are going to think that I'm crazy as well. So if people know that you're seeing a psychologist, a psychiatrist, receiving mental health services, they'll want to distance themselves from you. When in fact, you're trying to just take care of yourself. But once again, in the African American community, we view it as something extremely negative. I have had some of my patients tell me that their family members would be very, very angry with them if they knew that they were seeing me or another provider. They would have to hide that literally from family members. The stigma about seeking mental health services is off the charts. It's almost nondescript. We can't really understand it. But within that African American community, seeing someone is just like the worst thing. When someone is just trying to take care of themselves. The popular view is that African Americans have already been subjected to enough stigmatization through the mass media that they refuse to open themselves up to further scrutiny and character assassination. There's the notion dating back to slavery that one should embrace life's difficulties without complaining or appearing weak. And that runs deep in the African American culture. The stigma associated with seeing a psychologist, especially for mental health services in the African American community, contributes to African Americans underutilizing mental health services, and therefore their needs for mental health services go unmet. So number one is the stigma. It's real. And people want to keep that to themselves because they know if they put that out there, if others realize that they're seeing someone, they're going to think that, man, this person has some serious issues and I don't want to get close to them. So they begin to disassociate themselves, disconnect themselves from someone who's seeking help. So it runs deep within that African American culture. So number two, African Americans are reluctant to seek psychological services and seek professional treatment because of cultural norms that have been ingrained into the African American person's thinking. Culture is a driving force when it comes to our decision making. Now, culture is ingrained in someone. You can't take culture out of a person. It's there. In the African American culture, one of the things that we learn at an early age, don't put your business out on the streets. No, you don't put your business on Front Street. That's wrong. Keep it to yourself. What happens within the family stays within the family. We have to keep our family secrets. Don't let anybody into your business. Don't let them in. Don't do it. You have to protect your family. Okay, you have to honor your family no matter what the cost is. And then we're also taught that you should be able to solve your own problems, bro. What's wrong with you? You're a man. Take care of your own business. Don't put your business out there to somebody that you don't know. You can't even trust that person. Don't do it. No, you don't have to go that way. You can't go and tell private information to a stranger who has not earned your trust. Don't. That's messed up, man. Don't do it. Keep it in the family. Let me talk. We can talk. We can talk this through. You're not a man if you do that. That's the message that we get. We're taught at an early age. Going to see someone is a sign of weakness, when in fact, going to see someone is a sign of strength. But we're taught that seeing someone is a sign of weakness. You don't need to go and have somebody tell you what you need to do. You can figure it out yourself. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's the message that we get. And it's a tough message. And once again, if you go, you're crazy. There's something wrong with you. So African Americans struggle with the cultural norms and the messages that have been imparted and taught to us. So that's number two. There's a reluctance to seek psychological services and mental health services because of cultural norms that have been ingrained in us for years, especially within that family system, because that's ingrained in us from an early age. Keep your business to yourself. Keep it here. Don't let people in, because you don't know what they'll do with that information. They might use it against you. That's the messages that we get. And those messages resonate with us. And in so many ways, we think that if we go and see a psychologist or receive mental health services, we're betraying our family. And family loyalty is so important. So that's it. Number one is the stigma attached to seeing someone. And number two, the cultural norms that have been indoctrinated within us. Don't let people in. Keep this in the family. Number three, African Americans, the majority of us, are in denial about having a mental health issue. Hey, I'm good. I've got no problems. I don't need to see anyone. It's good with me. Mental health is not something that is openly talked about on a day-to-day basis in family life. African Americans don't talk much about mental health issues. It's frowned upon. It's seen as something negative. Once again, the history of stigma surrounding mental health, specifically in the African American community, contributes to the normalization of self-medication, such as alcohol abuse and ignoring destructive symptoms. Hey, listen, just go have a drink. Once you have a drink, trust me, you'll be good. And if anything else, you can sleep it off afterwards. It's very easy to hide behind one's denial mask about their mental health problems because it's not an easy subject to talk about. And once you present that, some people might start to look at you in a very, very different way. They may start to say things behind your back. It's a huge risk to let others know that you're experiencing mental health struggles because you don't know how they will react to you. So sometimes being vulnerable with people that we can trust tends to come back to bite us or to haunt us. We care about what others think about us. Some people are comfortable being in denial about their mental health struggles because there's a real fear about making changes in their lives. Making change isn't easy. As human beings, we don't embrace change. We're taught that the only one who likes change is a baby in a wet diaper. But as human beings, change isn't easy for us. And when you're in denial about your mental health struggles, you don't have to take any responsibility. Therefore, you don't have to do anything about it. Number 4, unfortunately, there's a lack of culturally competent providers for African Americans. 71.2% of licensed professionals, licensed psychologists, are members of the dominant culture. And 11.2% of treatment providers are African Americans. Most African Americans feel more comfortable talking to an African American provider. For the simple fact, people like people who look like themselves. So I understand that. They believe that an African American provider will be able to identify with their struggles on a higher level. When working with African Americans, especially Black males, it's extremely important to directly and therapeutically address issues of racism, discrimination, prejudice. Culturally competent treatment for African American takes into account the impact of everyday and perceived racism that happens throughout the day. When you go to a restaurant and the waiter or the waitress doesn't serve you, or they wait a very long time, or they're rude, disrespectful. So we have to acknowledge that. So that provides identification. You know what? I've had that experience as well. And this is how I dealt with it. So it's important to have culturally competent providers who you can identify with. And that's not always easy. With racism, which is always alive, and it's tied to the historical underpinnings of slavery in the United States. Being able to address race, discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes, that's important. That's an important aspect of building a relationship and a trusting therapeutic relationship with an African American person. And that does take some skill as well as that identification. You know what? I grew up in a single parent home. I saw violence. I saw substance abuse. So that identification is an important part. Number 5, a belief in God is very, very important in terms of dealing with African Americans. Because the aspect of God in our lives has been central for the majority of African Americans. According to a Gallup poll, African Americans are more religious than any other race or ethnic group in America. There are some African Americans who have either or their way of thinking, meaning that someone must believe in God because God will heal us from our struggles. So they would rather put their faith in God, and nothing wrong with that, because my faith is strong. But it is important to know that God puts people in our lives, in our communities, who can help us and who also have a strong faith. So that central issue of having God in your life is important, but sometimes that can be a barrier for African Americans to seek help because they say, you know what? I have faith in God that God will heal me. God will heal me from this mental health illness. And if he doesn't, I'm okay with it. So that central issue of your God healing you is important in the African American community. In times of trouble or crisis, many African Americans turn towards their religious leaders, such as pastors, elders, ministers, bishops, reverends. The church is looked at as a primary mental health treatment provider. If a pastor doesn't believe in the benefits of mental health, professionals, then this type of thinking will be conveyed to the congregation. As I said, I'm a strong believer in God. And I certainly believe that with God, nothing is impossible. Nothing. But I also believe, once again, that God puts people in our lives for reasons. And we have to have the belief that this person can help me. So we've got to put faith in others, just as how we put faith in God. Many African Americans feel that their faith will heal them and carry them through whatever mental health problems or psychological problems they have. So faith is important. I hear stories in terms of grandparents telling family members how much faith they had in their God. So yes, put that faith in your God. But it's okay to reach out to others, especially too if they believe in the same God as you do. Number 6, African Americans have historical mistrust when it comes to the health and medical community. And this has been well documented. One of the major disasters in history regarding African Americans and the health field, the medical community, is the Tuskegee Experiment. This study took place in 1932 by the U.S. government's public health services to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis. The African American men in the study were not told that they had syphilis, and they were deliberately kept from being treated for their condition. The study didn't stop until 1972, when the story received national attention. The study began with 400 untreated and uneducated African American men in Macon, Alabama. By the time the experiment was stopped, only 74 African American males were still alive. Many African American males could have been saved by penicillin, which had become available to the general public in 1946. An apology was not issued to the families of the patients until the late 1990s by then President Bill Clinton. The researchers were allowed to benefit from the study and publish their results for over 40 years. It has not been a good marriage between African Americans and the medical community. And those struggles still evolve today. They're still present. The message is that we don't care about you. That's the message. And we have no problems using you as a guinea pig for our benefit. The story of Henrietta Lacks is another tragedy in the African American community and the medical community. Henrietta died of cervical cancer. Her cells were taken from her body without her knowledge and without her permission. They were used to form the HeLa cell, which has been used excessively in medical research since that time. There are countless other stories concerning the atrocities inflicted on African Americans by the medical community. During civil rights, pregnant women went to hospitals but they weren't allowed to deliver their babies. So it hasn't been a good history between African Americans and the medical community. So that causes tremendous mistrust. And that's a barrier concerning treatment, to seek psychological services, mental health services. When we don't trust, it makes it difficult. Because one of the most important things in a good relationship is when there's trust and respect. There are countless other stories to be told. Countless. Number 7, there's a fear that therapy notes will incriminate African Americans. Here's what I mean by that. When someone comes to see me, I have to render a diagnosis. If the person is required to see me as a requirement of their job or due to an EAP situation, the African American person becomes petrified. What's my diagnosis? They're going to know. I don't want them to know, because if they know, that's going to be a problem for me on that job, and I need that job. So they're worried that psychological notes or mental health services treatment allows them or their workplace to have access to their personal health information. But I always have to assure them that there are laws that protect these protected information. There are HIPAA laws, so we have to be careful. But generally, African Americans are worried about that. They don't want their employers to know what their diagnosis is, and I can understand that, because people can use that against them. But I always tell them, you know what? There's laws of confidentiality. And as your provider, as your psychologist, my job is always to protect your best interest. That's right there at the hierarchy, is protecting you as the patient. But feeling that your health information will be compromised and your workplace or your boss will know certain things about you, don't worry about that. In closing, I know that it's never easy to seek professional help, especially for African Americans. It can be anxiety provoking. It can be very unsettling. It can be nerve wracking. It can feel strange, but sometimes it's good to take the first step. One of the things that Dr. King said is that you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step. So when you take the first step, it makes a difference. It can make a difference, but you've got to take the first step. One of the things that I've noticed in my practice is that many women are encouraging their husbands, partners, boyfriends, loved ones to go and seek professional help. For the most part, it's the men that are usually afraid or resistive, apprehensive to seek professional help. Now, let me read a recent email that I received from someone. Dear Dr. Forrest, my name is Karen, and I was recommended to you by a friend. I am searching for an African-American psychologist for my husband. Are you taking on new patients? Do you take my insurance? My husband struggles with the following, and I think he would benefit from talking to an educated Black male. My husband is a proud Black male and a private person. Recognizing he needs help is the first step. He is struggling with depression, childhood issues, struggles with not feeling good enough at work, drinking to mask the pain, and there's a lack of self-love. I hope that you can see him, because I think you can help him. Here's another email from an African American male. Dear Dr. Forrest, my name is Paul Smith. I was recommended to see you by a friend. I must be honest with you. I am not a person who is comfortable telling my feelings or business with someone I don't know. I have fought tooth and nail with my wife over this issue. She has told me that a strong mind is just as important as a healthy body. I have recently come to the conclusion that I cannot solve my problems alone. I have spoken to family, friends, and my lovely wife. Unfortunately, speaking with them has not had any effect on me. Which brings me to this email. I am wondering if we could possibly meet sometime this week. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. When I received that email, I had to respond right away because I had to give him props, because I know that it's not easy to reach out. So I was just really touched. And I responded right away. And here's what I want people to understand. That when you're in a situation, you can't see that situation objectively because you're caught up in it. Someone else can see things a little bit more clearly than you can. So as I tell people, my job is to help them see the forest from the trees. But when we're in a situation, we can't see things clearly. So that's why I always say, you know what? You might want to think about seeing someone. Get a fresh lens to look at things and help you to unpack things in a real, objective manner. Here's what a female said to me when I asked her how she feels about coming to counseling. She said, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed to come because of what family or peers would say and think about me. She said she had to swallow her pride so that she could come. So for some of us, it's a pride issue. She said, my family didn't want me to come. She said her oldest brother is against counseling. He feels that I'm strong enough to handle anything. So she didn't even tell him she was coming because she already knew what he had to say. She said, I'm afraid to find out if I have a mental disorder. She talked about feeling like she's weak and helpless. I had to let her know that coming to see someone is never a sign of weakness. It shows tremendous courage. So I had to give her credit for coming, for making that decision in light of the things that she shared. The great Socrates said, "An unexamined life is a life that's not worth living." And when people come to see me, we examine things. And sometimes the examination can be painful. But it's like having a wound, and you pour a little bit of salt in that wound. It's going to sting. It's going to be painful. But in time, it's going to produce healing. So that's what it's like coming to see a psychologist or receiving mental health services. It's not an easy step, but if you take the step, you might be pleasantly surprised. She talked about feeling scared to be judged, or feeling that something was really wrong with her. I can go on and on about her fears, but she was being transparent. She had real concerns about coming to see a psychologist. It's not easy to reach out to a professional because sometimes you just never know how things will go. But I encourage you that if you take the chance, it could be a really good step, a really good first step. I'm going to close with a story. A few weeks ago, I had someone come and knock on my door. I was in session with someone, and it was an African-American female. So I stepped outside, and she said, "My son needs to see you. I really want you to see him. And I'll just pay you to see him because he needs your help, but he won't come to see you." So I said, "Call my assistant and leave his name and number with her, and I will call him." So later on, I got a message. "Here's his number. Call him." And right now he's saying he doesn't have too much to live for. So I called him and I got him. We spoke for a few minutes. I said, "You know what? My schedule is tied up and I'm not getting out of my office until 7 o'clock. But you call me at 7 o'clock, and once I hear from you, we'll go from there." So at about 10 after 7, he called me. So that told me a couple things. First, he wanted help. He was motivated to receive help. So I said, "Give me your address." He gave me his address. And I went over there and I saw him. And the first thing is he said, "My mom told me that you would call me. And I didn't believe her. But I believe her now." I said, "That's great." I said, "What's going on?" So we talked. We talked. Because once again, communication is a lubricant for relationships. And he said a couple of really interesting things to me. one of the things that he said really touched me. He said, "I didn't know if you would be able to relate to me." So I said, "How come?" And he explained, and I said, "If I can't relate to you, then I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing." So I identified with him in many ways. He played sports. I told him I played sports. He grew up in a single parent family. I told him. Same for me. So I identified with him. He told me about his faith in God, and we connected on a spiritual level. So that was really, really good. And he told me about his struggles. And we just sat there and talked. Had a great time. And one of the things that he said again that really touched me, he said, "I was afraid that if you came, you would look down on me." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you're educated and you have a degree, and I don't have a degree. I thought you might look down on me." I said, Never. Tell him that the only way I could look down on someone is if I'm bending down to help them. So we just talked. I spent a good hour with him. And he gave me his word that he wouldn't hurt himself. And before I left, we embraced. That's the part of my job that I love, is to help people and to connect with people. As African Americans, it's not easy to seek out psychological services or mental health services, but I encourage you to do it, especially if you need the help. And if someone is saying, "You know what? I think you need to do that," give it some good consideration. Because the person who's telling you that, they care about you. Because it's not always easy to be upfront and to be honest with people. But when people are telling you that, they love you. And just know that in this game of life, we all struggle with different issues. But if you can get help, professional help, seek it, so the struggle can be lessened. It's been my pleasure. And let me say this before I close out. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. Be kind and be nice to that person, because you just don't know. Your words can bring healing to that person. We're all fighting a battle, and we're in the battle together, even though it may not be the same battle. It's been my pleasure. Thank you. Good night.